All right, so we're going to go pretty quick. I am probably going to skip a lot of how I'm setting things up and just talk to you about how to get the answers. So in this first one, remember we always want to make sure it equals 0. I tend to make sure that my A is always positive, but if you work this a different way, it doesn't mean you're going to get the wrong answer. So I'm going to move 78 and the 5m over, which is going to give me 3m squared minus 5m minus 78 equals 0. All right, that gives me A is 3, B is -5, and C is -78. So when I set up my quadratic formula, I'm going to get negative, let's see, I'm actually just going to give you the answer. And that is, I get positive 5 plus or minus the square root of 961 all over 6. Okay. Remember, we need to break down this number, 961. I promise your numbers will not be that big on your test tomorrow. This actually does not break down, so that means I'm ready to go ahead and state my answer. Does not break down. Okay, so if I name my two roots, what we did in class today, they are 5 plus the square root of 961 over 6, and 5 minus the square root of 961 over 6. All right, if I'm going to describe them, which is what's at the bottom, 961 is a positive number, so I know that those are both two real roots, so I know I'm picking either between A or B. All right, I don't have a double root, I don't have imaginary roots. Rational or irrational, remember, has to do with this square root part. So since there's a square root still in it, that's going to make this irrational. So my answer is going to be B right here, 2 irrational roots. And the last part, which I didn't put on here, but just for your own practice, is axis of symmetry. And remember, that comes from the part without the square root. So that means my axis of symmetry is 5 over 6, x equals. All right, let's look at question 2. Okay, this one does equal 0 to begin with, which is awesome, but it does kind of have a trick to it because I've only got two numbers here. So my A is 1, because that's what's in front of this x squared. You may notice that the B is missing, because normally it goes like x squared, x, and then the number. But if you notice here, there's no term with just x, so that means B is actually 0, and C is -8. All right, so if I set this up, that's going to give me x equals 0 plus or minus the square root of 32 all over, let's see, 2. All right, so now we're back to the part where we're going to break this down. Oh, sorry, break down 32. So if I do that, let's see, 8 and 4, 2 and 4, 2 and 2, 2 and 2. Remember, I need to make pairs. So this is, there's 5 2s. I can make 2 groups, which is going to give me 4 on the outside, square root 2. So if I rewrite that in my equation, I have x equals 0 plus or minus 4 square root 2 over 2. Now I'm going to, at this point, as soon as you break down, your next step should be to split apart, if you can. All right, so I've got 0 plus 4 square root 2 over 2, and 0 minus 4 square root 2 over 2. I'm just trying to explain this in a way that makes the most sense for you all. If I have 0 and I add something to it, the 0 part isn't even there. So this is the same as 4 square root 2 over 2. Right? Think about that if you had like 0 plus 7, that's just 7. Okay? And then you may notice here that your whole numbers, so I'm tracing my whole numbers, I can divide them both by 2, which gives me the answer 2 square root 2. That's one of my roots. So roots. And then my other root, 0 minus 4 square root 2 is -4 square root 2 over 2, which is negative. Let's see, I'll move that equal sign. -2 square root 2 if I divide both of these whole numbers by 2. All right, so those are my two roots. And now if I'm going to answer my question, this is an example of, it is two real roots because I was taking the square root of a positive number. And these are irrational because they both have square roots left in them. The last part is to name my axis of symmetry, which in my equation, if I look, so notice I'm looking all the way back up here where I set up my equation. That says 0 plus or 0 over 2. So you could write 0 over 2, but that actually divides, which means my axis of symmetry is just 0. All right. Okay, I am aware that some of these are tricky, so just stick with me. They should be hopefully getting a little bit easier. All right, need to make it equal 0 first. So 11m squared plus 2m plus 5 equals 0. So my A is 11, B is 2, C is 5. No negatives, that seems like a good sign. All right, x equals -2 plus or minus the square root. I'm getting -216 when I actually type things into my calculator. So remember, I'm skipping a step. So you need to make sure you have that set up over 2a, so that's 22. Now, I noticed something right away. That is a negative number, which means I cannot break down. So you may want to make a note that you cannot break this down because it's negative. And then, because that's the case, because it's negative, that should automatically tell you no solution. So when it asks for the roots, you're just going to say there are none. When it tells you to describe the roots, so if I zoom out, if I want to describe the roots, that's going to give me 2 imaginary because it's negative. And then I can still give an axis of symmetry. So that's negative. If I look at my equation, that's this -2 over 22. Or that's -1 over 11. So in your notes, since we're using them tomorrow, you may want to write -2 over 22 and then show yourself that you're simplifying that to be -1 over 11 for your axis of symmetry. All right, hopefully these are getting a little bit easier. Again, I need this to equal 0, so n squared. I'm going to move my 10 over, plus 10n plus 20 equals 0. A is 1. B is 10, C is 20. When I set up my formula, x equals -10 plus or minus the square root of 20, once you plug everything in, all over 2. All right, I'm going to, same place I always start. All right, got to break down 20. So that's 4 and 5, 2 and 2. Square root of 2 times 2 times 5. I've got a pair of 2's that come out, so that's 2 square root 5. So in my equation, I have x equals -10 plus or minus 2 square root 5 all over 2. We can split apart here and then simplify, or simplify and then split apart. And when I say simplify, I'm talking about the whole numbers. So I'll kind of follow the same pattern I did before. -10 plus 2 square root 5 over 2. -10 minus 2 square root 5 over 2. And when you do that, you really can't like add any of that together, but notice all of these whole numbers are divisible by 2, so I'm going to divide them and get my final 2 answers. So my roots are going to be -5 plus 1 square root 5. You could put over 1 if you want to. All right, that's one root. And my other root is -5 minus 1 square root 5 all over 1. And then when I go to describe my roots, I have real roots because 20 is a positive number. And then they're irrational because I've got the square root left. All right, last part, remember, is axis of symmetry, which is, if I look at my equation, that's -10 over 2. Which is -5. Okay, last one. Remember, we got to make it equal 0. I'm going to move both of these things over. So x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 0. A is 1 because there's no number in front of the x squared. B is -2, C is -1. All right, so I've got x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 8 all over 2. All right, same place we always go. Break down 8. 4 and 2, 2 and 2, square root of 2 times 2 times 2. Got one group, 2 square root 2. So I've got x equals 2 plus or minus 2 square root 2. Now, don't let all those 2's confuse you. If I do the exact same thing I did on the previous problem, it's at this point that I'm going to break into two different answers. So I've got 2 plus 2 square root 2 over 2, and 2 minus square root 2, 2 square root 2 over 2. Now we're going to look at our whole numbers, and I can divide all of these whole numbers right here by 2, which is going to make my answer 1 plus 1 square root 2. Remember the 2 on the bottom, that could write all over 1, but it just means the same thing. So this is one of my roots. And then my other root is going to be 1 minus 1 square root 2. All right, those are my two roots there. The last part is then to describe those. So if I describe, that's going to give me, I have real roots because I took the square root of a positive number, and again, irrational. I promise they will not all be 2 irrational roots on your test tomorrow. And then axis of symmetry is the last part. Remember, I'm going to look back up. We can actually go all the way back up here. I'm pulling this part. So axis of symmetry is x equals 2 over 2, which is the same as x equals 1. Please, 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 please come see me in the morning if you need help to make sense of your notes, because remember, you won't be able to ask questions during your test.